Welcome to Recovering Evangelicals, a podcast for people who were once very comfortable in the Christian faith until the 21st century intruded and made it very hard to keep on believing. I'm your host, Luke Jansen.
And I'm Scott Dyer.
A few weeks ago, I was looking around for topics and ideas for episodes to kick off this new season in our podcast, and it came to my attention that there was a new book about to be released on this very topic of deconstruction, and written by someone who I recognized as a very popular writer and author, Dr. James F. McGrath, and his book, Beyond Deconstruction, Building a More Expansive Faith. So I reached out to his publisher, Eerdmans Publishing, on a Monday. By Tuesday, I had an advanced copy of the book, and by Thursday, I'd read the book, I'd made notes, and scheduled an interview with Dr. McGrath. And here he is now in our virtual studio. Dr. McGrath, welcome.
Thank you for having me on the show. Great to be here.
Can we refer to you as James?
Yes. Oh, please do. Please do.
No relation to Alistair.
Not any time in recent history.
Yeah.
We went back far enough. Could there be? I don't know, but yeah.
It's not a bad name to have, though, in the field, eh?
Well, it depends. I remember some people saying, well, why do you do this, that, the other? I was like, I think you're thinking of another McGrath. It's not that uncommon a name that.
Right.
James, I've got to say, though, when I checked into your credentials, I was expecting a very British academic scholar. You did religious studies at the University of Cambridge, then a Bachelor's of Divinity at the University of London, and then a PhD in New Testament Studies at Durham University, also in the UK. So, with that behind you and with a name like Dr. James F. McGrath, I was totally expecting you to come on with a North Hyde Park British accent of some kind. But you're as American as they come.
Pretty much. Although, as have had the opportunity to discover in conversations of late, as somebody who's originally from New York City, that's both as American as you come, but also only one of many varieties of being American. And we're discovering that many of us had assumptions about what America and Americans are like that are being shattered by people with other backgrounds and in other places.
Right.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And from the Canadian perspective, I think a lot of Canadians tend to see the States as homogenous. And I've traveled quite a bit in the States, and it's not homogenous. It's in many ways, it's 50 countries,
Okay. Now, I also want to say for the listeners about you that you're a prolific author. I think I counted a dozen books and then a long list of scholarly articles. And you're a regular writer at your Religion Prof blog hosted at Pathos. And one interesting factoid about you I found out, you're a science fiction author who tries to tease out theological points from science fiction.
I do, yes. It was somewhat an unexpected twist. I've always enjoyed writing and enjoyed writing fiction as well as nonfiction, but didn't do much of it for a very long time, but started dabbling as I was teaching courses about the intersection of religion and science fiction, just dabbling with some story ideas. And then somebody that I've gotten to know pretty well, Paul Levinson, who works on the intersection of religion and popular culture quite a bit, was putting together an anthology of short stories and essays about the intersection of religion and spaceflight. And he was expecting, in contacting me, that I would offer an essay. And I was like, would you be willing to consider a short story? And that ended up being my first published short story. We've had a few others since then. So.
Very good. Well, to close the loop on our introducing you to our audience, I just want to say, I'm going to tie some threads together here. You're currently the Clarence L. Goodwin Chair in New Testament Language and Literature at Butler University in Indianapolis. And I just want to stop for a moment. We academics hear this phrase in introductions all the time. We hear people say, our speaker for today holds the chair in, something. But you don't often hear that outside of the university walls. And to some people, some of our listeners, they picture you as the holder of the chair holding a chair. They wonder, what's that about? So when we say that someone holds a chair in some academic position, you don't just have to be successful in getting a job at the particular university, in this case Butler, which is, by the way, a fairly large and prestigious academic center in its own right. You don't only have to be competitive in that sense, but a chair position involves a pool of funding that's set aside specifically for a certain area of academic work to help the university attract a high caliber academic in that given area of research and teaching. So in this case, the Goodwin family set aside a large endowment that was specifically dedicated to getting the best of the best, in this case, New Testament language and literature.
Yeah, thank you for explaining that. It's easy to forget that people will hear a phrase and think, doesn't the chair hold him?
Yes.
It's like most of the
Yeah,
time,
yeah.
it's like, isn't it the other way around? Yeah, so the Goodwin chair is actually has an interesting story to it. The Goodwin family, they're descendants of Clarence Goodwin who are still around, and I've had the opportunity to connect with them because of my appointment. They still are interested in what the university is doing with that, but they actually basically lost track of the chair for a while. So Butler used to have a very large graduate program in religious studies, theology, and when Butler moved away from its religious affiliation, that graduate program that became Christian Theological Seminary. And so after that, Butler had a smaller, sort of liberal artsy kind of religious studies program, like just academic study of religion. And so had one Bible person who was the Goodwin chair, but then the New Testament person who was the original holder was replaced by somebody who did mostly Old Testament Hebrew Bible. And then the same thing happened again. And by that point, nobody was even thinking about this. And so when I came to Butler, most people had forgotten that there was a chair. And it was my department chair who was, I used to joke that he was like Xerxes, like couldn't sleep and was like browsing through a list of endowed spaces and chairs and things at the university. Doesn't sound like exciting reading, but I'm glad he did it because discovered, hey, there's a New Testament chair. Why isn't we could propose that our New Testament person be appointed to that? And so
Right.
it is actually even in the Chronicle of Higher Education. It's like appointed to a sort of a long lost chair. So,
Okay.
Interesting.
James, a word of advice, if I may. It sounds better if you say it took them 60 years to find the right person for the job. Now,
I'm curious, what was the religious affiliation of Butler before?
it's a denomination that I didn't encounter prior to coming here, but it's quite well known in the Midwestern part of the United States and in some other areas as well. It's the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ.
Okay. Okay. Interesting. And now it's completely secularized, like it's not part of
Yep.
that. Okay.
Yep.
Sounds like similar. Luke went to McMaster in Hamilton, and same thing. McMaster at one time was a Baptist university, and actually during the modernist split in the 20s, it moved away from that, and now it's just one of Canada's premier secular universities. But it also still has a theological school there that has privileges that go back to that time. So it's kind of a similar situation.
Yeah, a lot of schools have gone that route. The University of Chicago started out as a Baptist school, which is
right.
interesting. So
Now,
Yeah.
I
Wow.
said I was going to pull together a few threads here. So I was impressed when I was looking at your credentials and finding out about you. I came across your acceptance speech of this prestigious award. And so I'm seeing this academic audience, scholars, very prestigious and important people. And I was impressed how you were weaving into your slideshow images of long-lost religious artifacts and dusty manuscripts. You also had images from the original Star Trek series and the Star Wars franchise and Arthur C. Clarke's Space Odyssey.
yeah, I have not reviewed that speech. Right, I didn't have any reason to, so I've forgotten that. All I'll say is that that's what I would expect to see if I went back and looked at it. One reason why teaching at Butler has been just such a good fit for me is that if I was at a bigger, primarily research focused institution that had a bigger area, maybe had even a department of New Testament or biblical studies, I would have been told to stay in my lane, right? You're the Gospels person. Don't start working on Paul. Don't. Whereas here, if I wanted to do some dabbling on the subject of religion and science fiction, want to write about an obscure Gnostic group that survived down to the present day, they're like, fine, no problem
Good.
whatsoever. And as somebody who has diverse, is an intellectually curious person, if you want to view it positively, or has a very short attention span, if you want to view it negatively, this has been a really good fit. Some of the things that I've done since being here probably would have been discouraged or even just out of the question someplace else.
Okay, so let's talk about the book.
Not at all.
It releases February 3rd, I believe.
Yep.
Right. And Eerdmans is the publisher. And despite the fact that you're incredibly academic and scholarly and could easily lose your audience in very esoteric theological minutiae, this book is a really easy read. One doesn't need any kind of a theological or biblical background. And it comes with high recommendations from the theological elite. I particularly liked what Tripp Fuller had to say about it. I'm going to read this here. Chip writes, James McGrath has accomplished something remarkable. He's shown us how to be more biblical by being less biblicist, more Christian by being less dogmatic, and more faithful by embracing uncertainty. So James, tell us about this book and what kind of an audience you're trying to reach with it.
Yeah. So, I mean, Tripp Fuller is, I think, a good example of somebody who can do the somewhat obscure academic theological stuff couched in appropriately obscure, challenging language. And yet, boy, can he preach. And he can talk to a general audience. And between blogging, between teaching not just upper level courses in areas of specialization, but also teaching a fair amount in our core curriculum, often to students who you can't assume are interested in the subject, right? They might be trying to meet a core curriculum requirement, and this was the only course that fit their schedule. And so thinking about how to communicate to a general audience, as broad an audience as possible. I also teach adult Sunday school at my church, and there are an astonishing number of lay and retired ministers in there who will never fail if I wander off on some academically interesting but quite esoteric tangent. They'll bring me back and say, okay, so what's the practical relevance of that? What do we do with that? How do we apply that in our lives? What's that good for? And so this book is very different from anything I've written before, except blog posts, right, which were sort of aimed at a general audience. But this is the first book of this sort that I've written. It is less about my sort of New Testament scholarship, the kinds of things that I do in like my biography of John the Baptist. I've written other things for a general audience, but those are still about those kind of New Testament type of topics. This book is much more about my journey and telling a bit more about my story and how it unfolded, in the hope that, not the precise details of it, but the approach might be useful to others. What people who've never gone into biblical studies, or academic study of religion might be surprised to find out is that if, because of a set of beliefs about the Bible and what the Bible is and its importance, if that leads you to pursue a degree in theology and the academic study of the Bible, what will almost certainly happen, unless you're at a very narrow institution that doesn't have you reading mainstream scholarship, what will happen is that you discover the Bible is not what you thought it was.
Exactly.
And that's a curveball, right? I'm motivated by this faith that holds the Bible of great importance and views as an authority, and now I'm studying it, and it keeps challenging my doctrine about the Bible. And you're not told that that's something that's going to happen. And so what I realized as the term deconstruction started catching on, as people were talking more and more openly, right? Because people have always had this experience, but as people were talking more openly about the process of discovering problems with your worldview, possibly having it collapse and just losing all sense of what is true and what to believe and being very confused, that people who do what I do have followed that path before them. And we've been doing this for a very long time. And so it seemed appropriate to share some of the experience. What happened? How did I process it? And how is it that I came out the other end with a form of Christian faith? It's certainly not fundamentalist. You wouldn't label it as evangelical, not conservative. But I do believe it's, at the very least, an authentic form of Christian faith. I have reason to think it might be a more authentic form of Christian faith than the one that I previously had. But even if I'm wrong about that, it's definitely among the options. And there is a strong historical case to be made that as far back as we can trace, the progressive and liberal elements have been there, right? The emphasis on inclusion and breaking down of barriers and welcoming those who were previously excluded.
So this word deconstruction, it's always interesting to me how words that were once used in very specific academic, philosophical settings and movements break out of that into the popular parlance, and deconstruction certainly is one of those. But it's very in vogue these days to talk about deconstruction and deconstructing. I don't think most people who toss the term around have ever read, Foucault or, or Derrida or, any of the people who really began this movement and process. But talk about that a bit, the whole concept of deconstruction.
Yeah, so it starts out as really an approach to literature, right? Looking at the things that historically were the kinds of things that you would neglect, you wouldn't pay attention to, the things that are at the margins, the things that are left unsaid, and just really doing things that sort of explore those. And so I think the first footnote in my book is that, if you're an academic who turned to this book thinking it's going to be about Derrida, sorry, no, the term has really moved in a different direction. But that close examination of what's neglected, I think is something that really is part of what deconstruction means here. Like recognizing, like a lot of people recognizing, wow, there's all this stuff in the Bible that I was never even told about, right? I mean, all this stuff about, to mention one that's very relevant in this present moment in Leviticus 19, that it's like treat the foreigner as you do the native born and things like that, right? Where it's like, So I think for some people, it's not doing the biblical scholarship thing, or, it's like they start listening to, whether it's someone relatively conservative to moderate like Mike Bird, or they're listening to somebody, who is no longer a Christian like Bart Ehrman or whatever, but they're exposed to biblical scholarship. For some people, it's just reading the Bible and discovering there's stuff in there that their church either doesn't talk about, but maybe even gets upset if you do start talking about it and start pointing out those things and saying, hey, we call ourselves Bible-believing Christians. Why are we not doing that?
So it's kind of a questioning attitude towards things, isn't it? Like it's kind of a critical approach to things rather than just accepting them based on authority or what you. And it seems to me, tell me if you think this is right, but that's been happening in academia for well over 100 years. But now, maybe due to the things like the internet and so on, this has become much more widespread. Where you can't hide, the church can't kind of hide anymore from this stuff. You think that's part of it?
Yeah, I think so. And on the one hand, I wrote the book for those who quite possibly found their way haphazardly into this experience and maybe resisted it for a very long time until and just through maybe conversations with people that they knew who disagreed with them or something else, had uncomfortable information and possibilities sort of brought to their attention until they could no longer sort of avoid them. But I definitely advocate this sort of curious approach. And if one wants to be proactive and not have a traumatic experience of your whole worldview collapsing, then you can start taking a look at it and start adopting this sort of curious approach and this openness to the possibility that you might be wrong, that you might have things to learn from others who disagree with you. And you can adopt that willingly, and you might spare yourself some of the trauma, right? Your views may still change when you start doing that. They may or may not, depends on what we're talking about,
right.
Depends on what evidence points to, it depends on your own experience. But even the fact of being open to it changes the dynamics of what your worldview is like and how you approach knowledge and faith and experience and other human beings and things like that. But for some, it's a traumatic experience. And so the book talking about beyond deconstruction is really broadly useful to lots of people or in lots of places, mainly for those who it's like the whole thing collapsed and now I'm defining myself over against what I was. And you reach a point where you're like, okay, surely I can not just say this is what I'm not, but talk about who I am. Talk about what I believe. Talk about what I value. Talk about what's meaningful to me, and do so in positive ways.
Right. So I guess to rephrase in a way some of the things that you just said a moment ago, I find it's ironic that it's so often the case that what triggers a dismantling of one's theology is just simply reading, just simply learning about your theology. So that's the irony, and it's a very telling irony. But here's the thing. What I hear you saying then is you advocate studying, getting into learning about what you believe in the whys and the hows, with the idea that you might be getting closer to a real understanding and embracing that, not going to study so that you can confirm what you were told is the case.
Yeah. And I think a lot of us who do go, I started out at sort of an evangelical Bible college, but as you mentioned, did so in the UK, and I'm sure that helped because British evangelicalism is still a much broader and more diverse phenomenon than tends to be in the United States. But the notion that you can't question things, is just so deeply problematic, even from a biblical perspective, right? I mean, there's, it's like test the spirits for crying out loud. If you can test the spirits, you can test anybody at anything, right? But all these warnings about finding teachers that tickle the ears and sort of say what people want to hear, and no one ever thinks that's what that applies to them. They always think it's those other people they disagree with, right?
Right.
And yet, unless you actually ask the question, you won't know, right? everybody thinks somebody else is in an information bubble and is just hearing things that are completely off the wall, whereas they're getting the truth because they are, whatever. And unless we make some effort to check whether that's the case, right, and to dare to ask, so what are other people hearing? Then there's no way to confirm whether whether you're the problem or somebody else is the problem, or both of you are getting skewed things that are equally false or equally misleading.
Hmm. So, James, Dr. McGrath, you teach at
Please call
this
me
university.
James.
Yes, but I'm making a point, though, because you are the professor, and that's my point. So you teach at this university, you're teaching New Testament, and you've got students in your classes who are doing exactly what we're talking about. They're checking out their faith, trying to understand and learn about their theology, and in the process, they dismantle. And you're instrumental in that dismantling for a lot of people. How do you deal with that?
Yeah. Yeah. So there are two reasons I wrote the book. One is I feel like, having been through the experience, I should, share that experience with others in case it's useful. But part of it is I'm aware that I may also be causing people to have this experience
Yeah.
by writing things that I do and by talking about the things that I do. At Butler, not being religiously affiliated, right, I'm not offering what we call it spiritual trauma care sort of in the classroom per se. But I do say to people, that, on the one hand, one of my values, right, and it would be very hard to like prove this in any kind of objective sense, but one of my values that I bring to what I do is that it is valuable and a positive thing to carefully, critically examine what you believe, right? And I have held that to be true for a very long time. And I say, if your views don't change as a result of taking this class, there's no requirement that you change your mind about something, right? But if you still hold views that you assumed were true when you started taking this class, I want them to go from being assumptions to being conclusions. Right? Because some of you are going to be right about stuff, and some stuff that I think I'm right about, I might be wrong about. And I think that by opening up that approach, on the one hand, for some students, it's going to be uncomfortable and unsettling. But I'm persuaded more than I'm persuaded that I'm right about this or that conclusion that I may have drawn, that approach is crucial to avoiding being deceived and avoiding deceiving ourselves. And I do try to tell students, at least from time to time, that there are things that, because this is not a religiously affiliated institution, that we won't do in class. We're not doing kind of a devotional reading and think about application, but you're free to do that, right? It's just that that's not the focus of what we're doing here. And if some of the content of this course is sort of unsettling to you and you want to talk about how that relates to your faith in a way that doesn't really fit in the classroom, I'm happy to do that. And there are resources available, including me. We will happily buy you coffee and we can talk more about that. And so I do try to make myself available in that way, but I'm aware of it. And one reason why I wrote this book is that even if I forget to say that, a student might notice, oh, there's a book that talks about this aspect of Dr. McGrath's life.
Right.
Yeah, that comes through in the book, I think, as well, the compassion. Many people probably heard the story. Richard Dawkins took out these bus ads years ago. There probably isn't a God, now enjoy the rest of your life, something like that. And, I thought, that's kind of like pretty glib, it doesn't show much compassion. Okay, he grew up, he's a scientist. Faith has played no role in his life. He's never had to deconstruct, really. That's been his worldview, but it doesn't show any empathy at all for people who have not grown up that way and who are going through a process of reevaluating things and the hellishness that can be for people. And I really think that your book really fills a niche there, and it comes from your own experience, right?
Yeah, and some of the compassion, is born out of the fact that I didn't grow up steeped in a certain kind of dogmatism in the way that some conservative evangelicals have, and I'm sure that helped me have a less traumatic experience of navigating some of this. But on the other hand, I held some views that I now regard as utterly false, mistaken, misleading, dishonest. And exactly who's being dishonest and who's just repeating what they heard is always hard to get at. But it's just like it's wrong. Doesn't matter whose fault it is and exactly how it came about. And so far from that leading me to say, well, I'm so much smarter and wiser now. It leads me to say, if I hadn't come across books that were helpful and perspectives that helped get me out of that, I might still be there. And I definitely think one of the most harmful things that I hear, and often it's from people who've deconstructed, is, I'll hear people saying, "Oh, these fundamentalists, can't change their minds." It's like, yeah, we can't, we do. People do change their minds,
Yeah.
but it's very challenging to do because nobody likes to think they're wrong, right?
No.
In fact, one of the oddities of academia, right? While there are some very dogmatic academics in not just in my field but in every field, for many of us, the excitement of it is precisely what if there's a possibility that we haven't thought of yet, right? What if maybe we're all wrong because none of us has come up with, maybe there's something we haven't even considered yet. What might it be? Like connecting these dots with evidence. And that process of discovery, yeah, even before I had really worked through a lot of these things myself, I had encountered a book by a New Testament scholar, and he started off, it was about sort of the body in Paul's writings. And he started off by saying, I used to hold this view that's very widely held, and I came to the conclusion that I was wrong. And I was like, that's just so beautiful that you're writing this book and publishing about how you understand these texts and this ancient author because you changed your mind. You studied the evidence and it led you to change your mind. And I knew that whether I end up, I don't even think at that point I was already sure I was going to be going into New Testament studies the way I did. But I knew I wanted to do that, right? I wanted my faith, my approach to the Bible, my approach to learning and understanding to be characterized by that openness to having the evidence change my mind. And I think it's telling that for so many, right, they say the Bible's the ultimate authority, and yet the Bible is effectively silenced, right? It's not allowed to say certain things. And I think one of the ways we can get through to those who claim to hold the Bible in high esteem is like, okay, so if every time I mention these texts that you're not such a big fan of, you say, well, it can't possibly mean this or that. It's like, so how does that fit your claim that you are believing the Bible and trying to to treat it as your ultimate authority? Right? There's a
Right.
tension, and that tension can actually be sometimes one of those things that helps someone break out of that narrow worldview.
James, I found a meme on your website. I don't think it was in your book. I didn't see it in your book, but I saw it on your website, which I think fits in here perfectly. I'm going to read it slowly so that the listeners can catch on, because you really have to pay attention. You have to see the words really to catch the irony. But here's what you have, this meme. Inerrancy is all about paying lip service to the Bible while actually working hard against it in order to prevent what it actually says from undermining one's extra biblical doctrine about what the Bible is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think I make the point in the book, but I think I found a way of making it, sort of, you don't have to read it twice in order to,
Right.
hopefully anyway. But
I
yeah,
love it.
I mean, that was a key. That was sort of a key discovery of mine. I mean, the thing that sort of I think broke down the barrier was realizing that I was defending my doctrine about the Bible from the Bible itself, and I realized that's inherently self-contradictory. It's self-defeating, and it just doesn't make any sense to do that.
Right. So in chapter 1, you really dig into the tension that Christians often feel between faith and works, doctrine versus doing. Scholars would say orthodoxy versus orthopraxy. And everyone knows that Jesus' teaching was all about orthodoxy, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think. Was it Robin Myers who put it in that sort of really pithy way that you read the Sermon on the Mount, and there's nothing that's really about what you believe, right? It's all about what you do. And you fast forward a few hundred years, and you've got the Council, the Creed of Nicaea, and the Nicene Creed is all about what you believe and nothing about what you do.
Right.
Yeah.
And it is a striking contrast. And so for those who've experienced the collapse of a very rigid doctrinal worldview, a sort of idea that being a Christian is all about believing certain things, one of the things that could be actually exciting and liberating and help you move beyond that is realizing that by focusing somewhere else entirely, you might find some things that make you sort of come alive and are invigorating to you sort of ethically as well as spiritually. But you're rediscovering something that was neglected and downplayed, but is central to Jesus' teaching. And in rediscovering that there might be a form of Christian faith that could work for you and that's different, having the teaching of Jesus be a focus seems like there's some possibilities there.
Right.
Well, no, I know it's too big a question, I guess, probably to answer it in a short podcast, but I guess just why did that happen? Like, what is it about that move to? Is it because the church become more institutional, so it needs to boil things down to some simple, here's the things. If you believe these things, you're in, boundary markers. I'm just curious as to how that evolution and why that evolution kind of occurred.
Yeah, well, I mean, one could spend a lot of time talking about that,
Yeah.
and it might be worth a future episode, to get somebody on to talk about that, with me or somebody else. But I think there is a short answer that part of it is what you highlighted, that being kind to others doesn't give you a strong sense of sort of group identity that allows you to feel like you've got something that others don't, whereas having distinctive doctrines can. I also think that some of the things, believing doctrines that others don't believe, denying mainstream science and saying that, well, we know better than the scientists because we have the Bible and stuff like that. It really does pander to our worst instincts towards pride, right? And thinking highly of ourselves and our own understanding. And even though the Bible is very, very clear, right? Trust in the Lord with all your heart, lean not on your own understanding. And you'll get that on bumper stickers of conservative religious people for whom they'll say they're not leaning on their own understanding, but what they are actually saying is, I lean on the Bible, and therefore, my understanding is correct, and that's not what that verse says, right? It's not even close, right? What's involved in doing what that verse says is actually recognizing that our human understanding is fallible, and therefore, even if God had given us an inerrant Bible, lo and behold, all these so-called Bible-believing Christians disagree on all kinds of stuff, right? And so, it's clear that we are fallible in our understanding. And so you need that humility. But that approach that focuses on doctrinal difference, on believing stuff that others don't believe, it feeds to that desire for a sense of group identity and of something that you can say, here, we've got this, and others don't. We're right about this, and others are wrong. And ironically, for when it happens among Protestants, it really turns believing those right things, whether it's the right doctrine about who Jesus is, the right doctrine of atonement, the right doctrine of predestination, or whatever else, it turns those things into works that one does, right, in order to achieve one's own salvation, right? By believing those things, this act of the will and of the mind and of this assent to these things is how you get saved, right?
Yeah.
And so the focus is so wrong, biblically, but even from the Protestant perspective, in which that kind of doctrinal dogmatism and focus actually tends to flourish more than anywhere else. And so that's why I started, among the chapters that explore alternatives to that prior worldview that you might have held, started there. And I said, if there's some doctrines, it's like you gotta skip ahead, then please do. But I really think it's healthy and helpful to actually realize how much of the New Testament is not actually focused on doctrine at all.
It's not on the final exam, I guess.
Yeah. Well, as I'm listening to you, there's always something inside my head that's arguing against me all the time. It's just how my mind works. So I'm thinking, if I'm the fundamentalist, and I'll say, but you know what? We come by this honestly because isn't Paul Mr. Doctrine? Isn't Paul the one who creates all these boundary markers and basically says, if you don't believe this, you're anathema, you're out, and so on, and rails against those who have any other gospel but the gospel that he believes that he's been revealed to him, and so on. So how do you deal with that?
Yeah, so that's a great question, right? And I think there's a great answer that Paul himself gives, right? Some people disagreed with him, and they were more biblicist in a certain respect than he was, right? He was saying that God is welcoming uncircumcised Gentiles in, not just into the people of God, but into the family of Abraham. And you go back to Genesis and the covenant with Abraham. It's like everyone who is, whether they're born into your family or bought with your money as slaves and become part of your household, everyone must be circumcised. Otherwise, they're cut off, right? And so that very text there is one of the places where we see that Paul is not a biblicist, right? In the way that and his focus is not on doctrine. It's about focus on these boundary markers like circumcision and using them to exclude other people that God wants to welcome, right? And I think one of the fascinating things, to discover, and those who want to dig into it more and read some of the academic stuff on it, just look up the new perspective on Paul. But realizing that these things were ethnic religious boundary markers of covenant identity, and that some people said, oh, I'm part of the right people group, I'm circumcised on the eighth day, descended of Abraham, and so on and so forth. And therefore, even if I do wrong, God will forgive me because I'm part of the chosen people. And others, even if they're doing what's right, they're uncircumcised and they've got the wrong beliefs, and God's going to punish them in the end. And that sounds so much like what you see in conservative evangelicalism, where it's like we're right, and therefore God's going to forgive us, and the other person they could be much better person than I am, but God's going to throw them in a fire because they didn't believe the right stuff, right? And so we've gone from an emphasis on what Paul said, but understood in a way that is really at odds with what he was emphasizing. So his language gets used as a tool for exclusion and for doctrinal self-righteousness, when in fact he was very much arguing against that. And I think that's one of those fascinating ironies. But that's just yet another example of the fact that you can say that the Bible is important, it's authoritative, and yet nobody knows the Bible intimately. They know a phrase from Paul's letter to the Galatians. They don't know the whole letter in detail, and then situated in its context. And so it's easy to be doing something that's not just different, but possibly even diametrically opposed to the meaning of those words and those actions in their original context, and yet to think that you're being quote unquote biblical.
Right. You reminded me of, I remember one time I literally heard a fundamentalist person, a friend of mine, say to somebody once, you're actually a better person than me, but you're going to hell and I'm going to heaven. What a horrible thing to say. Yeah, literally said that.
Wow.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. I mean, that's the mentality. I check the boxes, and so I'm in. But anyway, that's a great response on Paul in particular.
Well, I had a question at this point, which I'm thinking now, actually, Paul would be, what you've just been saying about Paul is a very special case of the question that I want to now ask. So we'll see if you like what I'm about to ask or not. So your book is not about deconstruction. It's actually, the title is Beyond Deconstruction, and you're getting at the whole idea of reconstructing. And you made a reference a few moments ago to finding alternatives, which I want to get into that. But there's something you said about finding alternatives, an analogy that you used that I thought is a great analogy because I agreed with you. But then as I thought about it, I thought, actually, no, I don't agree with you. So let me see what you think.
Interesting.
You gave the analogy of wanting to buy a car.
Okay.
And so when you start looking around, you bring somebody who knows a lot about cars because, they know what to look for and they know the pros and cons of any given car. If you're looking for a house, you bring someone who knows a lot about houses and house repairs. So extending the logic down to theology, if you're looking for a new theology, you should bring along a theologian. And that does make sense. It makes perfect sense on one level, but I have to admit that I've developed antibodies against theologians, and I've lost my trust in I have. I haven't been hiding that. We did an episode quite a while ago, episode number 91 with Dr. Beth Solderetter, and that's what we were talking about, that I just had difficulties with just accepting what theologians have to say, because it was often it was a source of my cognitive dissonance on a given point, a given dogma. It was because of what this theologian said against that theologian, against the third one. It was just so disorienting for me. So, what do you say then about this advice that you give of bringing a theologian?
Yeah, and I don't know that I said bring a theologian, but bring somebody who knows. And so I think the key thing is that if you bring along an expert in cars, to go car shopping, that might be, if it's somebody who really their primary concern is your well-being, and that you end up with something that will fit what you need and will be a good purchase. Then that will probably go well if you bring along that sort of expert with that sort of outlook. If you bring along somebody who is just like, this car is the best, and any other car is just not good, and that kind of has that sort of dogmatic allegiance to something, you might get something that person would have loved driving, but it's really not a good fit for you, right? So, I mean, any analogy has its sort of limits. The main things I would say, to just explore the analogy a little bit further, if you bring along a dogmatic Calvinist theologian or a dogmatic, conservative evangelical biblical scholar, and go to a conservative evangelical church and the preaching is good conservative evangelical exegesis of the Bible, then they're probably going to say, "Oh, that's great." But in what sense is it great? And are they coming? When I talk about consulting with experts, I want them first of all to be people who are interested in your spiritual well-being, and then second of all, I'm thinking in terms of people who actually have that broader approach to things, right? Who recognize the question is not, are they sort of towing the party line on, these doctrines and these kinds of things, but are they offering something that's healthy theology, right? And I think there is such a thing as healthy theology, right? And I mean, certainly when people start moving beyond sort of narrow conservative evangelical theology, sometimes they think that sort of open-minded theology is considering that, well, maybe everybody doesn't go to hell, or something like that, right? And that's just like the first steps, of like maybe sort of what we might call a sort of a broader evangelical approach. But there are theologians who are exploring ideas from other religions and engaging with them, not necessarily just borrowing them wholesale, but saying, this tradition talks about this way, and if we consider that, coming from the perspective of what the Christian tradition brings, what might we discover through the dialogue and engagement? What other metaphors might we need now that we have the images that came from the Hubble and now the Webb telescopes, right? We need to think about God differently within the context of our cosmos that we think about differently. And so there are theologians who are doing things that are much more sort of creative. There are people who are reading the Bible with sort of an awareness of the teaching of the prophets on social justice and economic justice and things like that. And if you bring them with you to the conservative Calvinist preacher that we talked about earlier, they're going to give you a very different diagnosis, right? And ultimately, I mean, on the one hand, I think the latter would be a better choice than the former, in terms of who to bring with you. But if you have somebody who is open-minded, well-informed, and interested in your well-being, then at the very least, the conversation that you and they have, I think, could be could be useful if you are whether you're church shopping or book shopping or doing anything else. So yeah, it's an analogy that I think has a certain usefulness to it. But the main point was that you shouldn't just, if you go to a church, if you look at a book, even if it's one of my books, right? Somebody who's trying to sell you a book or sell you on a church or sell you on a worldview is probably going to say, unless it's an inherently open-minded, explorational, creative worldview of the sort that I think we're advocating. But most people who are offering something narrower will say, we've got the answers. Those other folks don't, and so you want to come here. And the comparison I'm trying to make is that's like the used car salesman where you need to actually get somebody to look under the hood and say, okay, but what's behind this? And
Right.
what's the depth of it? And does this thing actually work? And are
Right.
these claims true and things like that? And so I think there is, you need to choose who you bring with you wisely. Obviously, it's a very good point. I probably should have emphasized that more in the book. But I think that bringing somebody who knows what to look out for, right? If you're not sure, can still be a useful thing.
And one of the things that you said, I think it was in the very same pages around that, you cautioned against people making, when they decide that they want to leave one expression of faith and find something else, that they too quickly then leap upon another expression of faith, which is really the same thing underlying it. It's just the same thing. Kind of like the rebound girlfriend, right? You don't want to get a rebound faith. And so you want to say a few things about that?
Yeah. And thank you for using, I think that image sometimes people do get, it's like, oh, sort of a rebound worldview, a rebound faith, thinking of it in terms of relationships. If you were with somebody who's, let's say, had certain characteristics that just, sort of you clashed with, then what do you do? If you break up with that person, you look for somebody who's like, very different in that regard, in that one area that was, causing problems. And what you don't realize is that that person is a human being. And while you'll be so excited about the differences from the previous girlfriend or the previous, whatever, all human beings have rough edges and all that differences of approach and personality. And so sooner or later, you're going to discover that you still have to work on, mutual understanding and finding compromise and all these things. And while religions are often sold, at least certainly by their conservative proponents, as truth that came dropped down from heaven in a package, all worldviews, including religious worldviews, are human constructions. Right? It's humans who did the theology. It's the humans who wrote these texts that are now regarded as sacred scripture. And none of them is going to be perfect. They're all going to have shortcomings. Our models of the universe, we hope they get better and better, but they have shortcomings and there are loose ends and there are things that we still don't know. And realizing that that's inherent in the nature of human worldviews, if you've been told that you're supposed to be looking for absolute divine truth, it's really unsettling. But once you've had a chance to sit with that and realize that there's nothing else at all, you realize, okay, well, then the right thing to do is to sort of shop around and recognize that no car is going to be perfect, but some cars are better than others, and some may have some serious flaws, and that it's like you definitely don't want to get that one, right? It's not going to last you very long. And to realize that we have a responsibility to investigate, to examine carefully, to weigh evidence before making a decision.
So to continue with that analogy of looking around and maybe looking for a faith that looks a little bit different but is much the same, I'm wondering if you should just look for something completely different. So instead of a car, buy a horse or buy a bike. Now, what do I mean by that? Obviously, that's a joke, but in chapter 3, you talk about looking for a whole different kind of a faith systems that are more based on experience. The title of the chapter is Faith That Experiences. And so you talk about looking for faiths that do pay attention to feeling instead of head knowledge. You talk about mysticism, music, literature. You even talk about suffering. So maybe talk a bit about that.
Yeah. I think the thing to emphasize is that there are multiple ways in which one thing can be quote unquote opposite in relation to another. And so what's the opposite of a car? Is it, an upside down car? Is it a horse? Is it a bicycle? It's a sailboat. And some of the things that you might get in the interest of being opposite might be even less suited to your needs, right? Getting another car, but one that doesn't have the problems with the first one might actually be a better fit than, And so that's sort of the cautionary remark that I was trying to offer in the book, that you don't want to do a pendulum swing of the sort where you hold ideologically opposite views and yet your whole approach to knowledge and to faith and to belief is the same, right? You're equally dogmatic, you're just on the other side of the spectrum or hold just opposite views. And I've seen this happen. I can think of a case where somebody was a conservative Christian with some very unusual and very narrow views, right? Well, we're the only ones who are right about this one thing and everybody else is wrong, who then became an atheist who was dogmatic about how we're the only ones who realized that there was no historical Jesus, and it doesn't matter, all those historians are just pandering to the Christians or whatever, and now is doing the anti-vaccination thing. And people who have that desire to be right and to be in a minority and think, I'm cleverer than everyone else because I know the truth, even though the majority of experts are getting this wrong. If you never question that approach to things, you can swap out one form of dogmatism for another form of dogmatism that's opposite in certain ways, and yet the whole approach to how you're doing this thing of formulating your worldview looks so very similar to somebody sort of looking in from the outside. And so I think, yes, absolutely. You want to avoid just doing a sort of a pendulum swing that's reactionary, right? You want to be thoughtful about it. You want to make sure that you're asking, is this, are there more fundamental changes that need to happen? And I think that, whether it's shifting to focusing more, even if it's only for a period of time as you work through this, focusing more on practice than on belief, focusing more on experience,
right,
than on dogma, right? I'm a Christian who thinks that anyone who calls themselves a Christian, especially those who understand theology and the historic theology of Christianity, should have a healthy dose of agnosticism, because it is part and parcel of our theological tradition to emphasize the limits of human language, right? That if you can describe the thing that you're talking about with perfect accuracy using human language, you're not talking about God, right? You've got an idol. And so making room for experience, right? Making room for music, not in terms of how theologically correct are the words, but maybe even just something instrumental that gives you this experience of transcendence that you find it hard to put into words, can be something that makes a positive contribution to your spiritual life and helps you discover other aspects of yourself that maybe you neglected previously.
Right.
I really enjoyed the section on Job and how you integrated Job into the book. And that's personal for me because Job has been a very key book in my own journey. And it's interesting how the Bible itself is deconstruction. The Bible is a book of deconstruction. It's constantly deconstructing, right? It's constantly tearing down ideas about God. And like you said with Paul, for example, well, we thought this was just, these were the boundary markers, and now Paul's realizing, it's not. That's deconstructing. But Job in particular, of course, is just a great parable, really, about deconstruction. I just thought I'd mention that because I really think it's an important part of the book and one of the most valuable aspects of the book.
Yeah. Thank you for pointing that out, because I think that's right. The Bible becomes something so much more useful, more interesting, and more intelligible when you stop trying to force it to be this set of statements that you can then affirm, and you realize there's stories that are exploring things, right? Job is a story about this person who shares the theology that his friends do, and yet realizes it doesn't fit his experience. And one of the most amazing things in the whole of the Bible is that at the end of this book that this person has written, doing this kind of philosophical thought experiment with this person who suffers worse than anybody ever has, as God shows up, right, after a whole book of Job complaining and the friends trying to defend God as they understand God, and God shows up and says, I'm angry with the friends because you didn't speak right of me the way Job did, right? Job was honest. He said he didn't understand, but he was like, if I could just talk to God face to face, we'd work this out, but it's not my fault. And my experience has shaken my theology, and I can't hold that anymore, and I've got to be honest about it. And presumably that's what God is presented as affirming at the end of the book. And so much conservative evangelicalism claims to be about faith, and yet so much of it looks like doubt. It's shielding these doctrines that are a house of cards that are constructed with little bits of the Bible, and yet the whole thing is the structure is inherently flawed and at odds with things that Jesus taught and that are found throughout the Bible. And defending that from any close scrutiny, right? That's fear. That's not faith, right? And having the courage to look closely because you care so much about connecting with God that you're going to closely examine, you're going to question, you're going to consider. That's faith, and that's what we should be inviting people to.
Yeah. Just a comment that I think you're talking about faith, and I think that one thing that I've come to realize is faith is not the absence of doubt. They coexist. You could have faith and be full of doubt. It's the I believe, help my unbelief kind of thing. And I think also of I think it was Thomas when Jesus says he's heading to Jerusalem and the disciples are saying don't go there, they're going to kill you, and Thomas blurts out and says, I'm going, I'll just die with them. Thomas has no faith this is going to be a successful mission. He's just attached to the person of Jesus and the experience of Jesus. And if that means he's going to die with Jesus, fine. That to me is one of the greatest statements of faith in the Bible, right? In many respects. So yeah, sorry for.
So in the short amount of time that we have left, I just did want to bring it back to this whole, you did write in chapter 3 about mysticism.
Yeah. I think that in my own case, one reason why I pursued study was that on the one hand, I thought I'm going to learn all the right answers. And on the other hand, where some things are unclear, maybe I'll even provide the right answer. And I do historical research in which I do try to draw conclusions and hope I'm right about things. I nonetheless approach things in a way that I realize I'm bound to be wrong about things because I'm human. And so I said when I was working on my recent John the Baptist project, it's inevitable I'm going to be wrong. I don't want to be boring, right? I want to come up with some interesting suggestions and make some, And so I think there are whole different ways that you can approach things. And the mystical, right? That's a term that, is very heavily laden and can mean different things depending on who's using it. But I mean the experiential, right? The sense that you are encountering sort of transcendent reality, right? People who are not religious in any traditional sense and are not religiously affiliated in that kind of sense, nonetheless will go into nature or be on a plane or something and will have an experience that reality is deeper and broader and multifaceted in ways that they can't put into words.
Right.
And I think that kind of experience historically has inspired some of the most creative theological reflection and the most sort of compassionate action among religious people. It's often been conducive to people realizing that, well, those people over there, they're using different language because of their different religious tradition, but the experience that they're reflecting through that language is actually probably the same thing I've experienced, right? And so it's
Hmm.
sometimes been conducive to, sort of interreligious dialogue.
Right.
And so I think that when you don't have that kind of experience, it's much harder to avoid just focusing on believing the truth of the words that others who have had that experience use sort of poetically and metaphorically to try to give some sort of pointer towards that experience they had. And so I think that making room for that doesn't always work, but can help one avoid sort of gravitating back towards dogmatism.
Right. So we are short on time. James, was there anything that we didn't talk about that you wish we had? This episode is all about your book, and is there something that we didn't quite cover?
Well, you mentioned chapter 1 and chapter 3, so I guess should just mention that there are other chapters in there.
Oh,
And
there
so,
are, really?
in, don't I won't bother saying what they are. You could poke around online or go into a bookstore and find them. But I did try to offer a range of approaches that I suspect for most people, each of those will have a place in this new worldview that you're articulating. The main thing is to provide resources so that you're not just constantly looking back, right, and defining yourself just in terms of what you're not anymore, right? And you don't think it's a problem to move beyond something and to recognize that that fact shapes you, right? The notion that we can just become something totally different, and not be shaped by our past experiences is clearly wrong, right? But I think that there's a risk, like when, even when you talk about, like recovering evangelicals or something like that, that it's like, okay, so you're no longer that. That's still, for the longest time in my case, and this is perhaps why I'm so concerned about this, I was still sort of apologizing for not being the thing I once was, right? Saying, well, I'm still a Christian, but I don't think we. And it took, some helpful voices making me realize I never sort of believed the whole Bible and took it literally, right? The way that the sort of the marketing slogan was for that sort of brand of Christianity that I was involved in, and so I'm not picking and choosing now, whereas before I believed everything. I was picking and choosing before and pretending I wasn't. And now I'm trying to approach this whole thing differently and more honestly. And that experience of recognizing that the thing that you're becoming might be a more authentic form of Christianity, but at the very least, a no less authentic form of Christianity than the one that you left behind.
Right.
I think that that's important. And that's, I'd say, the key takeaway of the book. And every person's experience will have its own uniqueness, but there are some commonalities. And I hope that what I've shared in there will be useful to many people who are working through this kind of experience, but especially if something that I wrote or said is the reason why you're having this crisis.
Well, it's a great book. We highly recommend it. It's an easy read. As I said, you do not need any kind of a biblical theological training whatsoever, and it's directly written for people who are in this process of trying to find a faith that makes sense in the 21st century, reconstructing. So now, James, is there any more books in the pipeline?
Well, I'm, in addition to having a chair of New Testament language and literature, I'm also serving as department chair at the moment, which is very different, means answering a lot of emails and dealing with paperwork so that others don't have to. So that's slowed me down a little bit, but I do have a number of things that I'm either starting to tinker away at or hoping to work on soon. Um, have an idea for a book, and have been trying to churn out at least a little bit of a sample and run it by a publisher about Jesus' parables as involving humor a lot more than we recognize, that there might be some of them that are not so much jokes as riddles, where you're supposed to like puzzle them out. Yeah, Matthew's notorious for coming in and like giving you the punchline before he's even told you the joke. And it's like, it's just, but Jesus himself doesn't seem to have done that, when we compare the gospel. I'm curious as well. I don't have any concrete steps in that direction, but once I see what the response to this book is and how it is or isn't helpful, there have been things that we've been dealing with in higher education I think are also relevant to the church. it used to be that you had to gather everybody together and put them in this lecture hall, and you have the podium up at the front, and then one person speaks at them. And that's also the traditional model of church, right? Where you have the pews facing one way and the pulpit facing the other. And now with the internet and knowledge flowing differently, whoever you think is the best preacher in the world, you can go and listen to them. Find their back greatest hits site and put those on constant play for the rest of your life. And so what do we have to learn as a church, and as churches from the field of education, from gaming, right, where you get this spontaneous connection of community by people who are involved in the same activities? And how can we rethink what it means to sort of be community and to try and foster community and foster each other's spiritual well-being in a very different context and a very different information age? And so at some point, I hope to write something about that, whether that'll be like the sequel, Beyond Church as You Know It or something like that. I don't know. But my work on things related to games and pop culture has me thinking about some of those things. Like what can we learn from others who still find community, right, and get meaningful, but it's spontaneous. Whereas a lot of churches are finding that, especially after the pandemic, discovering you could do stuff online, discovering that got out of the habit going every week, and so do I want to go back now? I think we're at this juncture where we need community more than ever, right? Because people looking at their screens and doing nothing else is very dangerous in a lot of ways. And I say that as somebody who's on a podcast and recognize that online community can be really rich and meaningful too. And so how do we put those together, right? How do we find the in-person? How do we recognize that some of the stuff that we used to need to be in person, once a week, doing it this way, doesn't need to be done that way? And what else might we do with our time? And so have some thoughts in that area. But at this point, much more have questions and things that I want to look into than any answers to share.
Okay. So no sci-fi novels in the works?
There will definitely be more stories. Had a story come out in an anthology recently that starts with the phrase, if anyone asks you why the second coming hasn't happened yet, look in government file X237915 or something like that. I can't remember the exact call number I put on it. But I'm going to continue writing fiction as well. Yeah.
Okay, James, Dr. McGrath, if I may, thanks so much for coming on to our show.
Yeah.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. I have thoroughly enjoyed our conversation and hope it won't be our last one.
Not at all. All the best.
Yeah.
We will talk again.
Thank you too. And thank you for all you do.
Thanks so much, James.
Bye for now.
Ciao.
Yeah.
You've been listening to Recovering Evangelicals with your hosts, Luke Jansen and Scott Dyer. Send your comments and suggestions for new episodes to lukejjansen@gmail.com. Join our private discussion group on Facebook by searching for the Recovering Evangelicals podcast group. Look for the logo that you always see at your favorite podcast catcher and ask to be let in. Subscribe to lukejjansen.wordpress.com if you want to get advanced releases and group posts. Or browse through our archive for a full listing of all our previous episodes. And please help the podcast by sharing with a friend and leaving a review at your favorite podcast catcher.